Well, hello, everyone. Rarely, I am actually on time today, right on time, on the dot, and that is because I don't actually have that long to fiddle fart around today. Fiddle fart, by the way, is a saying that one of my old coaching clients used to use. Anytime she was wasting time on something, she would say, I don't need to fiddle fart around with that. And there's no time to fiddle fart around today because today we've got a pretty tall order of business. We are going to be watching what happened at this morning's show trial for January 6th. I thought about live streaming it this morning. To be honest, I just couldn't stomach watching it that early in the day. I'm a late riser. For those who know me, I work late, I sleep late, and I couldn't handle it at 10 a.m. I'm sorry. I couldn't do it. But I can handle it now. I'm pretty sure. I don't have alcohol, sadly, because it's Monday and I don't usually drink during the week, but I do have Coke, Diet Coke for you nosy types, and I do have a bag of Takis with me, the Fuego kind. I also like the Blue Fire ones, but I'm going to be munching on some Takis, just like some popcorn, and we're going to be watching to whatever happened today on the January 6th show trials. Now, I do want to make note that I do have another obligation. I have another obligation at 7 o'clock tonight. And that is that I will be returning to hosting the community Zooms in my locals after a week break. And I'm so grateful for you guys for giving me the break. But we do have a constricted time frame because of it. You guys know with reaction videos, I sometimes like to drone on a bit and take much longer to react to things than need be. We're going to be barely able to fit it in. I might even be skipping around a little bit in today's show trial just to there are going to be some boring bits. We don't necessarily need to listen to everything. We just want to get the juicy details, all of those glorious lies that they're going to tell, because I need to be done by 7 p.m. to join my very best supporters in my locals community for our community Zoom. And if you would like to take part in our community Zoom, you are more than welcome to come and join us. What you need to do is head over to kb.locals.com/support. The link is in the description, and you need to sign up as a supporter. You can sign up for $5 a month or more if you're inclined. You can also sign up for $50 a year or more, again, if you're inclined, but you don't have to. The $50 a year gives you 2 months for free in my locals. You can also make a one-time gift. All of those are going to go right into supporting the work I do, keeping me streaming and doing this sort of stuff. So if you find value in it, I hope you'll support the work I'm doing, and you get the extra perk of getting to join me on private community Zooms, unrecorded, our own little safe space where we can talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about, and you can get support from other people. You can talk about what's going on in your life. You can complain about what's going on in the news. Pretty much anything is on the table, but you do have to become a member in order to take advantage of the perks. But I don't want to dwell too much on that. I do hope you guys will join me tonight. I think it's going to be a great community call. I want to jump right into the hearings, get this party started real quick. Share audio, Chrome tab. All right, guys, gird your loins, mount that like button. You're not mounting the like button for the show trial, okay? You're mounting the like button to support my work and to allow people to know that you appreciate that I'm trying to make all of this chaos a little bit more bearable for all of you. And of course, I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's go. I might have to futz about here a minute. We're not wasting any time with this nonsense. They fiddle farted around a good bit of the morning with this meeting. Okay.
And the very least we should expect
from
any person seeking a position of public trust is the acceptance of the will of the people, win or lose. Donald Trump didn't. He didn't have the numbers. He went to court.
Let me know if the sound is okay for you guys.
He lost. But he betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters.
Oh, and I wanted to say thank you, Redwood Elf, for the super chat. I appreciate that all of your chats before that would not fit in a single $500 super chat. I appreciate the notion, though.
This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election. And knew he lost an election. And as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy.
Oh, yes, we're going to learn more about Trump's 7-point plan.
By trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy. And in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol, sent by Donald Trump
mob of feds
to stop the transfer of power.
Feds.
Today, My colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, and our witnesses will detail the Select Committee's findings on these matters. But first, I will recognize our distinguished Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming.
You
for
will
any
recognize the
opening statement
traitor
she'd care to
Cheney,
offer.
the war criminal Cheney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, as the chairman noted, our committee began outlining a 7-part plan overseen by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we will begin looking at the initial part of that plan. President Trump's effort to convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him by overwhelming fraud. A federal court has already reviewed elements
Notice
of the
she's
committee's
clarified
evidence on this point
overwhelming
and
fraud.
said this, quote, "In the months following the election, numerous credible sources from the president's inner circle to agency leadership and statisticians informed President Trump and Dr. Eastman that there was no evidence of election fraud," close quote, sufficient to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The court's opinion methodically documents each of the principal reasons for that conclusion, and I would urge all those watching to read it. Today, we will begin to show the American people some of our evidence. Today, you will hear much more from a former Attorney General Bill
Oh, Benjamin
Barr's
is right. We
recorded
can probably watch
testimony.
this at 1.25
And you will
speed.
hear in
Good call,
greater
Benjamin. I'm going to
detail
do that.
what others in the department told President Trump, that his claims of election fraud were nonsense. You will also hear much more from President Trump's own
Yeah, Liz
campaign
Cheney is
experts,
definitely more
who
bearable
had
this
also
way.
concluded
Good
that his
call.
fraud claims could not be supported. Let me focus briefly on just 3 points now. First, you will hear firsthand testimony that the president's campaign advisors urged him to await the counting of votes and not to declare victory on election night. The president understood even before the election that many more Biden voters had voted by mail because President Trump ignored the advice of his campaign experts and told his supporters only to vote in person.
Because they committed
Trump knew
voter
before the
fraud
election
by
that the
mail,
counting
which
of
we
those
now
mail-in
know from
ballots in
2000
several
Mules.
states would not begin until late in the day and would not be complete for multiple days. This was expected, reported, and widely known. You will also
They committed
hear
voter
testimony
fraud
that
by
President
mail.
Trump
That's
rejected
why.
the advice of his campaign experts on election night. And
That's my
instead
opinion,
followed the
YouTube. I'm
course
allowed to have
recommended
I'm
by an
allowed to have
apparently
opinions,
inebriated Rudy
YouTube.
Giuliani, to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent. He falsely told the American people that the election was not legitimate. In his words, quote, "a major fraud." Millions of Americans believed him. Second, pay attention to what Donald Trump and his legal team said repeatedly about Dominion voting machines. Far-flung conspiracies with a deceased Venezuelan communist allegedly pulling the strings. This was, quote, "complete nonsense," as Bill Barr said. President Trump's own
Yeah, I'm going to pause it there. I think that was one of the stupidest lines that they tried to sell. To be honest, if they had just stuck with the mail voter fraud line, which is by far the most believable of this entire thing, I think they would have gotten a lot more progress. The whole Venezuela thing was stupid. That was stupid.
campaign advisors, his Department of Justice, and his cybersecurity experts all told him the same thing. Here, for example, is White House
Thank you,
lawyer
Skid
Eric
March, for
Hirschman.
becoming a
His
gold
view
member
was
on the
shared by
channel. I
many
really
of the Trump
appreciate it.
team whom we interviewed.
I thought the Dominion stuff was, I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
Correct. That was dumb.
And third, as
Real
Mike
dumb.
Pence's staff started to get a sense for what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th, they called the campaign experts to give them a briefing on election fraud and all the other election claims. On January 2nd, the general counsel of the Trump campaign, Matthew Morgan, this is the campaign's chief lawyer, summarized what the campaign had concluded weeks earlier, that none of the arguments about fraud or anything else could actually change the outcome of the election.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the
She looks like a
fraud,
condescending school mom.
maladministration,
Liz
abuse, or
Cheney.
irregularities,
Condescending school mom.
if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
As is obvious, this was before the attack on the Capitol. The Trump campaign legal team knew there was no legitimate argument, fraud, irregularities, or anything to overturn the election. And yet President Trump went ahead with his plans for January 6th anyway. Mr. Chairman, hundreds of our countrymen have faced criminal charges. Many are serving criminal sentences because they believed what Donald Trump said about the election and they acted on it. They came to Washington, D.C. at his request. They marched on
And
the
then you
Capitol at his request.
overcharged them
And hundreds of them
with
besieged and invaded the building
nonsense
at the heart of our
in
constitutional
order to
republic.
demonize an
As
entire
one
segment
conservative
of the American
editorial board put it
population,
recently,
Liz.
quote, Mr. Trump betrayed his supporters by conning them on January 6th, and he is still doing it. Another conservative editorial board that has long supported President Trump said last week, Donald Trump, quote, won't stop insisting that that 2020 was stolen, even though he has offered no proof that that is true.
There's a whole
And
movie
this,
about it. It's called
Donald
2000
Trump
Mules.
now, quote, clings to more fantastical theories, such as Dinesh D'Souza's debunked 2000 Mules.
Who debunked
Even as
it?
recounts in Arizona,
debunked it?
Georgia, and Wisconsin confirm
Who
Trump lost.
debunked it?
Those are the correct conclusions to draw from the evidence gathered by this committee. We
Liz
have much
Cheney
more evidence
just
to show the
declares
American people
something
on this
debunked,
point than
and
we
that
can
means is
reasonably
Liz
show in
Cheney
one hearing.
chief fact checker
But
now?
today, we will begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our opening hearing, we gave an overview of our investigation into the January 6th attack. The plot to overthrow the election was complex and had many parts, which we'll explore in remaining hearings. But today, we examine the false narrative that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. Former President Trump's plan to overturn the election relied on a sustained effort to deceive millions of Americans with knowingly false claims of election fraud.
I just want to make a really specific note because they're doing something that's really you can see the talkies on my hands. They're doing something really specific here, which is they're pretending that they're exposing Trump's plan to overthrow the government, but what they're actually doing is they're trying to debunk the whole idea of election fraud. Now, they don't need to actually spend any time on election fraud at all in order to illustrate that Donald Trump had this 7-point plan to overthrow the duly elected president. They don't actually have to focus on the case for election fraud at all, but they're devoting an entire hearing to it on day 2, which tells you that that is the storyline that they are most afraid of. That's really the point of this hearing, is to really hammer home, do not ever call us out on our bullshit, ever. That's what they're worried about. It's not about Trump at all. It's about this.
All elements of the plot relied on convincing his supporters about these false claims. Today, we'll demonstrate the 2020 election was not stolen. The American people elected President Joe Biden. We'll present evidence that Mr. Trump's claims of election
81
fraud
million
were
votes.
false,
Definitely.
that he and his closest
Definitely.
advisors knew those claims were false, but they continued to peddle them anyway, right up until the moments before a mob of Trump supporters attacked the Capitol. We'll also show that the Trump campaign used these false
People
claims
who
of election
legitimately
fraud
win
to raise
elections
hundreds of millions
don't
of dollars
have to
from
relitigate
supporters who
that
were told their
win
donations
over
were for
and
the legal
over
fight in
and
the courts.
over and
But the Trump
over
campaign
and
didn't
over
use the
again.
money for that. The big
Sam says, Star Trek Next Generation, the drumhead, so similar to this. I'm not a Star Trek fan, but I'll definitely ask Victor about that later, Sam. And if anyone wants to explain it to me in the chat while we're watching this nonsense, I would greatly appreciate it.
big lie was also a big ripoff. The former president laid the groundwork for these false claims well in advance of the election. As early as April 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the only way he could lose an election would be as a result of fraud.
You know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election.
Sin said, and guys, I want to encourage everyone to subscribe to Sin's YouTube channel because it's great. Sin says, interesting that they are using Liz Cheney for the debunk myth. What was she given for saying those things? Money? Power? Liz Cheney is going to be on the receiving end of a sweet fat book deal or a lobbying deal or a contributor deal, probably on CNN. We all know what Liz Cheney's getting in exchange for this because she ain't coming back to Congress. That is for sure.
As if the election is rigged. Remember that.
Oh, it's about a
The only way we're
kangaroo
gonna lose
court.
this election.
Thank
This
you.
is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible
So
thing for
Trump
our
is
country.
pointing out
This
problems.
Is not, this is not going to end well.
Mr. Trump decided even before the election that regardless of the facts and the truth, if he lost the election, he would claim it was rigged. Mr. Trump was right about one thing. It did not end well. On election night, Mr. Trump claimed even before the votes were counted that his loss was a result of fraud. Now, Thursday, we had testimony from Attorney General Barr about the Department of Justice investigation of Mr.
Traitor
Trump's
Barr.
fraud claims. Barr told Trump directly that his claims were BS. Yet, after hearing the truth and that warning from the AG, Mr. Trump continued to peddle the false claims of fraud. You'll hear detailed testimony from Attorney General Barr describing the various election fraud claims the Department of Justice investigated. He'll tell you how he told Mr. Trump repeatedly that there was no merit to those claims. Mr. Barr will tell us that Mr. Trump's election night claims of fraud were made without regard to the truth and before it was even possible to look for evidence of fraud. Attorney General Barr wasn't alone. You'll see and hear today other Department of Justice officials and senior advisors to Mr. Trump that they told him the claims he was making were not supported by evidence. The election fraud claims were false. Mr. Trump's closest advisors knew it. Mr. Trump knew
Oh,
it.
Alex, you
That didn't
mean
stop him
that
from pushing the false
when
claims
people
and
talk
urging his
about
supporters
important
to, quote,
problems,
"Fight
conservatives
like
don't
hell," to,
listen when
quote,
they really
"take
should?
back their country."
I am
After he lost
shocked.
the election,
I am
various
shocked.
legal challenges were made. You'll hear testimony today from a renowned Republican election litigation lawyer who will explain the normal process by which candidates challenge an election. Rather than accept the results of the election and the decisions of the courts, Mr. Trump pursued a different strategy. He tried to convince the American people the election had been stolen. Many of his supporters believed him, and many still believe him today. The attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr.
Because
Trump's
some of us
decision to
have
use
brains.
false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and to cling to power. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now welcome our first
This
witness.
is so much better. Speed it up. Why didn't we think of
We're
this last
joined
time?
today by former Fox News politics editor Chris Steiwalk. Bill Stepien,
Where is he now?
President Trump's former campaign manager, was subpoenaed to be here and was in Washington this morning, prepared to testify. Kevin Marino, Mr. Stepien's attorney, is here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Marino, for coming. And he has advised us that Mr. Stepien's wife went into labor this morning. Mr. Stepien unexpectedly had to travel to be with his wife, and we wish him the best. Due to the depth and rigor of our investigation, we have several hours of Mr. Stepien's testimony from when we interviewed him in February, and we will be presenting that testimony today. I'll now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you.
Sorry to take myself off mute. I don't know if you guys can hear the crunching of the Takis, which is the best chip that has ever been made, as I'm near the mic. So let me know if that's troublesome and I can actually not just... Let me know if you guys can hear me munching on things I shouldn't be munching on. Skidmark says, attacked the Capitol. Very few did. But what about the videos of police and security holding open entrance doors and so-called insurgents walking in through the doors calmly? Yes, that's exactly right. It did look like there were just a lot of doors just kind of left open for people to walk in. And then when they walked in, what did they do? They stayed between the velvet ropes like a bunch of hooligans. Didn't even leave the rope line.
You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. I want to start by showing a
Or
video
were
that
they
tells the
fake?
story of what was going on in the
What a
Trump White House
concept.
on election night in November of 2020.
Do you remember where you were on the night of the election, November the 3rd?
I was at the White House.
You know where specifically over the course of that night you spent your time within the White House?
There was an event that was organized in the residence, so I moved between the residence, a room sort of off the residence where some family members were.
I take it the president was upstairs in the residence.
He was upstairs.
Jared
we were
Kushner
kind of
is
on the
not
first floor,
happy.
so not upstairs. We were with mostly with Ivanka and her brothers and a couple other people who'd be coming in and out.
Can you just describe the atmosphere? What were people expecting that night when you got to the White House? think that there was, typically for people who show up there on election night, it's going to be a self-select, more positive environment. I think people were a little bit nervous, not knowing what was going to happen with the red wave or the.
I'm still
red mirage
perturbed
as
by the fact
debate
that
was being
Jason Miller
carried
is
out.
wearing
The
like
Fox
a
News Decision
ridiculous
Desk is calling
mask.
Arizona for Joe Biden.
Makes me
That
question him.
is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Arizona's called. Do you remember that?
I do.
What do you remember happening where you were when Arizona was called?
There was surprise at the call.
Who was surprised?
Most
Literally
everyone.
everyone,
Were you being one of them?
because they called it at the beginning
Yes.
of the night with
Did
no
that shift
votes
the
in.
atmosphere, the attitude in the White House?
I remember.
Completely.
Hang on. I remember when Arizona was called. Fox effing News called Arizona, and basically as soon as the polls closed, when they had no votes in, but they refused to call Florida all night long. This, if you remember back to November of 2020, this is when a lot of conservatives started giving up on Fox News because they refused to call Florida when it was obvious Trump was going to win it. They called Arizona at the beginning of the night like a bunch of shills.
How so? Can you describe that?
Because Fox News was the first one to go out and say that.
See?
So was it anger kind of directed towards Fox News for making a call more so than a disappointment that maybe the campaign lost Arizona?
All the above.
The votes weren't in yet.
So both anger and disappointment.
Both disappointed with Fox and
The
concerned that
votes were
maybe
literally not in
our
yet.
data or our numbers weren't accurate.
They
Were
weren't
you
in.
the White House residence during the sort of past midnight into the early morning hours of November 4th?
Yes, oh, sure. It went over beyond midnight, yes.
Do you remember Rudy Giuliani being at the White
Sam says, Nancy's gavel is Thor's hammer. The QAnon shaman is speaker. Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's how fragile our democracy is, Sam.
House on election night and into the early hours the next morning?
I do.
What do you remember about when he came?
He was there were I had heard that he was upstairs, you know, in that aforementioned reception area, and he was looking to talk to the president, and it was suggested instead that he come talk to several of us down off the map room.
You said that you had heard that Mr. Giuliani wanted to talk to the president and then he was directed your way. Did you end up talking to Mr. Giuliani when he was directed your way?
I did.
What was that conversation?
A lot of conversations were directed my way. A few of us, myself, Jason Miller, Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Steffi and Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
Everyone was probably drinking that night. That's a very good point from Phil.
I spoke to the president.
Everyone was probably drinking that night.
President, but president spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
I remember saying that, to the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay, can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it. They're stealing it from us. Where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being
Ivanka knows
counted.
exactly what she's saying here.
It was becoming clear that
Ivanka's
the
playing a
race would
role
not be
here.
called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to.
Ivanka's trying to make people think that she doesn't really know anything and that she wasn't involved, which I think is really telling because they all know that this is all for show. They all know that this is a gut you moment. So Ivanka, what I bet she's trying to do is just play like, I just do what Daddy tells me. I just wasn't really. Ivanka is way smarter than that. She's extraordinarily smart. She's playing a role. And I also think one of the things I was thinking when I was like listening to this and eating my Takis was that it seems to me that this might give us a lot of insight into how incompetent the GOP was in terms of taking election fraud seriously. Because the GOP did not take election fraud seriously at all. And that is why we're in this position. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't listen to Trump. Every time he said it was going to be a problem, they did nothing before the election. They didn't even try to do anything before the election. And I suspect that this is going to give us a lot of insight into how not seriously the GOP took election fraud. Have they changed that? I don't really know. I tend to think not.
To tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in a.
Was this guy actually the campaign manager?
And we'll have more to say about this, the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who was that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words.
They didn't do anything on a state level, Phil. They didn't do anything on a state level before the election. That's part of the problem.
They were going to, he was going to go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election.
Mr. Steiwalt, did President Trump have any basis to declare victory on November 4th, 2020?
What is this guy's role? Who
Thank
was
you.
he? Hang on.
Mr. Stepien also testified that President Trump had no basis for declaring victory at that point in time.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position.
So this guy that they have testifying, not this guy here, but the guy that they actually sit there that they have sitting in the room testifying that was on Fox News. I basically looked up his Wikipedia, and it seems to me that he was one of the people defending Fox News's decision to call Arizona that early. And so I don't trust that guy at all. He's an establishment conservative shill, which is why he's testifying in this hearing in the first place. Because that decision to call Arizona so quickly from Fox News was absolutely irresponsible. I'm sorry, the numbers were not there. They did not know. They called it early to have the early call, and anyone defending that early, it was unnecessary. They could have called it an hour or two in. They could have fucking waited. There was no reason to call Arizona as early as they did, particularly when they refused to call Florida, which was obviously going for Trump. So anyone who defends that decision to call Arizona early, I don't care if Trump really won or lost. I am specifically referencing the decision to say Trump lost Arizona at the right after polls closed, when they literally had no idea what the numbers were. That's what I'm talking about. So this guy is a shill, not this guy on the stream, although he probably is too. But the one we're going to hear testifying, shill, nothing more.
And we'll have more to say about this, the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
Thank you. Mr. Steiwalt, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Oh, come on. And
That's
the
the
fact
bottom
that he
line.
just answered it
You
like
had
that.
an election, Mr. Trump lost, but he
Yes, this guy literally. Oh, hang on. I know we're on a time crunch, but let's just hear this again. I just want to play this again. Okay, hang on.
Thank you. Mr. Stilwell, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Thank you. That's the bottom line.
And that's the bottom line. And that's the bottom line. That's the ultimate fucking tell of this entire show trial, that the chairman of this sham committee just said the bottom line is that Joe Biden won the election. That's what this is all about. They are trying to create propaganda for the American people, and their only goal, the bottom line goal that the chairman of the committee just said to you clearly, is that they want to put to bed any notion that anyone other than Joe Biden properly won the election. That is the goal of all of this. It has nothing to do with Trump. It has nothing to do with January 6th. They want to cover their tracks for what they did. That's it.
We've had an election. Mr. Trump lost, but he refused to accept the results.
Why don't they just accept that we stole
Pursuant to
the
Section
election
5C8
with
of
mail
House Resolution
fraud?
503.
That's an opinion you
And
obviously.
questions.
Oh, and
Thank you,
that's the
Mr.
only
Chairman.
question.
I'd
Okay.
like you to explain
Yeah.
a term that was thrown around a lot during the election, and that's the so-called red mirage. What does that mean?
So in the 40 or 50 years, let's say, that Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans do. So basically, in every election, Republicans win.
Gee, I wonder why Democrats prefer voting by mail. It is a mystery why more Democrat votes come in via vote by mail. It is but a mystery, possibly a timeless mystery that will never, ever, ever be solved in the course of our lifetimes. Does anyone in the chat want to ponder a theory about why Democrats might prefer voting by mail rather than going in and doing it in person when it's really not that hard to do it? I am at a loss for what the answer to this mystery of our time might be.
In election day, and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting, and it depends on which ones you count first, but usually it's election day votes that get counted first. And you see the Republicans shoot ahead, and then the process of bailing and binding and unbinding all those mail-in votes. And some states like Pennsylvania refuse to count the votes first. So you have to wait for all of that to come in.
It's very similar to that mystery about why every state at the same time stopped counting votes at around 2 a.m. on election night. And then they said they were just going to end for the night and they were going to pick it back up in the morning. But when I woke up at 6 a.m. and checked the returns to see what the votes were, all of a sudden at 4 a.m., it is but a mystery what happened between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when every network had declared that they were just not going to count votes and they were going to pick it back up in the morning. And then all of a sudden, 4 a.m. That's when it happened. Yep. Yeah, I would say, if I were going to commit voter fraud, I would probably do it by mail. That just seems to be the easier way to do it for me. I'm just pontificating. I'm not suggesting that that's what happened in the 2020 election. I'm just positing a theory that it might be easier to cheat in vote by mail rather than going in person. Savard says you don't need a Biden win. You just need the perception that it happened, and then act that belief out accordingly. This council is narrative control. That's exactly right. This council is trying to create the perception, the illusion that Joe Biden won in a palatable way that can be easily accepted by people who have been dumbed down by the schools and dumbed down by the media so that they stop thinking for themselves.
So in every election, and certainly a national election, you expect to see the Republican with a lead, but it's not really a lead. When you put together a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't matter which piece you put in first. It ends up with the same image. So for us, who cares? But
And then Murphy's Pool says, was cheesecake flavored beer served at January 6th, or did you have to bring your own? I, in fact, had wine and champagne on I didn't actually, well, no, on January 6th. No, I didn't drink on January 6th. I was thinking of election night. I did actually have champagne on election night. I don't think I had anything to drink on January 6th. I was traumatized. I ate a bunch of cookie dough on January 6th. That's what happened when I got back to my hotel. I ate a bunch of pasta and a bunch of cookie dough, and I drowned my trauma in carbs.
That's because no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. We had gone to pains.
Oh,
and
hang on, another super chat. Sorry, guys. Chris Baker, good to hear from you, Chris. You and Dennis Pratt had a great show in Reno. I immunized myself by giving Jackie Perry an envelope with my hair. I didn't get sick. It was. I'm not going to say that, Chris. I don't want to know what was in that envelope. But I'm glad you didn't get sick, and I'm glad that Jackie Perry didn't curse you.
proud of the pains we went to make sure that
She
we were
tried.
informing viewers that this was going to happen, because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try to exploit this anomaly. And we knew it was going to be bigger because the percentage of early votes was higher, right? We went from about 45% of the votes being early and absentee to, because of the pandemic, that increased by about 50%. So we knew it would be longer. We knew it would be more. So we wanted to keep telling viewers, hey, look, the number that you see here is sort of irrelevant because it's only a small percentage of these votes.
So this red mirage, that's really what you expected to happen on election night.
Happens every time.
Thank you, Mr. Steyerwalt. Now, I'd like to play a clip of Attorney General Bill Barr, who also explains
That guy is such
what
a
was expected to
sellout.
happen
You
on
can tell
election
from his
night.
eyes. He is not a man that's proud of himself. He is a
Right out of the box
sellout.
on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. And it seemed to be based on the dynamic that at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states. And that seemed to be the basis for this broad claim that there was major fraud. And I didn't think much of that because people had been talking for weeks and everyone understood for weeks that that was going to be what happened on election night.
Mr. Stepien obviously could not be with us today, and it's proper for him to be with his wife as they welcome their child.
Well, I'm glad we can acknowledge
But he
that.
also had discussions with the president about the red mirage. That is, that it would be a long night and that early votes would favor him, but that lots more votes would be counted over the course of the night and the days after. So let's play clip 1 from our interview with Mr. Stepien.
I recounted back to that conversation with him, in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night. I told him in 2020.
Sam says, someone smart must have reversed her amateur hex. Jackie actually tried to hex our table. Someone caught Jackie. And this is about the Reno convention, the Libertarian convention. Someone caught Jackie around the New Hampshire table, sprinkling some sort of something around our table. So she was trying to do it in person too. That's real. That's the type of shenanigans that happens in libertarian culture. Savrit says, I uploaded my new vid as Spark Part 1.5 2.0 coming soon. Guys, check out Savritz's channel if you would like to know more about his perspective, which I find to be really interesting.
20 that, it was going to be a process again, as, the early returns are going to be, positive, and we're going to, be watching the returns of ballots as, they rolled in thereafter.
Is it fair to say you're trying to present what you thought would be a realistic picture of what might happen over the course of that night, being election night?
That night and the days that followed. Yeah, I always told the president the truth, and I think he expected that from me, and I told him it was going to be a process. It was going to be, we're going to have to wait and see how this turned out. So I just like I did in 2016, I did the same thing in 2020.
So let's watch a short clip of President Trump speaking after he received that information from his campaign advisors.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
Which is what happened.
So when former President Trump said that, it contradicted what his advisors had warned would happen. We all know that mail-in ballots played an important role in the 2020
Then
election.
why did they announce
However,
that they
President
stopped
Trump
counting votes?
Continuously discouraged mail-in voting. Mr. Stepien was so concerned about the president's position on mail-in voting that in the summer of 2020, he met with President Trump along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Let's play clip 4.
Meeting that was had, in particular, I invited Kevin McCarthy to join the meeting, he being of like mind on the issue with me, in which we made our case for for why we believed mail-in voting, not to be a bad thing for his campaign. But you know, the president's mind was made up, and he understands, you know, how many times to, you know, go to the well on a particular topic.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a little bit more about the argument that you and Mr. McCarthy made to the president in that meeting as to why it wasn't a bad thing that mail-in voting was available.
Largely two pillars to that argument, both of which I've previously mentioned. One, you know, leaving a good deal to chance, pushing or urging your voters to vote only on election day leaves a lot to chance. That's A. And B, also previously mentioned, the fact that the Trump campaign, Republican National Committee, the Republican Party had an advantage of grassroots workers and volunteers on the ground that would allow, you know, an advantage to enhance return rates of ballots that were mailed. Those were the two pillars of the argument.
I see. And what, if anything, do you recall Representative McCarthy saying during that meeting?
We were echoing the same argument. I mean, his words echoed mine, and vice versa on those two topics.
Mr. Stirewalt, you were at the decision desk at Fox News on election night, and you called Arizona early for President Biden, which was controversial. How did you make that call, and where did you think the race stood in the early hours of the next day?
Well, it was really controversial to our competitors who we beat so badly by making the correct call first. Our decision desk was the best in the business, and I was very proud to be a part of it. Because we had partnered with the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, thanks to my colleague and friend Arnon Mishkin, had built a wonderful device for forecasting.
And
the
he's
outcomes
so
of elections.
proud
So
of
we had
it
a
that he
different set
doesn't
of
work
data
there
than
anymore.
our competitors did. We had more research, and we had a better system, and we had a great team. So what you're
It worked
waiting
out
to
so
see
well, he
is,
left.
do the actual votes match up with the expectations in the poll? The real votes are testing the quality of your poll in targeted precincts and in targeted places. And let me tell you, our poll in Arizona was beautiful, and it was doing just what we wanted it to do, and it was cooking up just right. And at some point, and I forget exactly who, but at some point it became clear that Arizona was getting ready to make a call. So we you know, my boss, Bill Salmon, said, we're not making any call until everybody says yes, because that was always our policy, unanimity. And you have to understand, in this room, you have, you know, the best people from academia, Democrats, Republicans, a broad cross-section of people who had worked together for a decade, who were really serious about this stuff. So we knew it would be a consequential call because it was one of 5 states that really mattered, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona were the ones that we were watching. We knew it would be significant to call any one of those 5, but we already knew Trump's chances were very small and getting smaller based on what we had seen. So we were able to make the call early. We were able to beat the competition. We looked around the room. Everybody says
yes,
yay.
beating the
and on we
competition
go.
is what really
And by the time
matters
we
when
found
you're
out
reporting
how much
the
everybody was freaking
news.
out and losing their minds over this call, we were already trying to call the next state. We had already moved on. We were to Georgia. We were to North Carolina. We were looking at these other states. So we thought we were pleased, but not surprised.
I see. You know, after the election, as of November 7th, in your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None. I mean, I guess it's always possible that you could have, you know, a truckload of ballots be found somewhere, I suppose. But once you get into this space, you know, ahead of today, I thought about what are the largest margins that could ever be overturned by a recount, and the kind of stuff that we heard Mike Pence talking about, sounding like a normal Republican that night when he said, you know, we'll keep every challenge. Nothing like that. In a recount, you're talking about
Mike Pence sounding like a normal Republican. That's his show. He's an establishment rhino shill. Mike Pence, a normal Republican. Guys, if from any members of the GOP, and obviously you guys know I am not, because I think that the GOP is a epic shit show that never has any hope of improving ever. But if your idea of a proper Republican, the very best that you have to offer the world is Mike fucking Pence, then you deserve to lose every single election for the rest of your life. Mike Pence is not an ideal politician. Mike Pence is a power-hungry establishment shill who will only do what he needs to do to attain his next office or to attain his contributor spot on whatever network he wants or to become the head of the RNC or to attain any of these positions of status, because that's really what it is about, status and presentation. If you think that Mike Pence is an ideal, normal Republican, dude.
About hundreds of votes. When we think about calling a race, one of the things that we would think about is it outside the margin of a recount? And when we think about that margin, we think about, in modern history, you're talking about 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes at the way, way outside. Normally, you're talking about hundreds of votes, maybe 300 votes that are going to change. So the idea that through any normal process in any of these states, remember, he had to do it thrice, right? He needed 3 of these states to change. And in order to do that, I mean, you're at an infant. You're better off to play the Powerball than to have that come in.
On November 7th, the other major news outlets called the race for President Biden. Now, Mr. Stepien told the committee that he thought the odds were, and this is a quote, very, very, very bleak, and held a meeting with the president that same day. Let's show clip 8, video clip 8.
With each day that wore on, I mean, the trajectory of the race on election night, Trump ahead in many states.
Why are they
And
doing
as-
this
as that
dramatic
wore on,
picture
as
of
the
him
third
looking
became the fourth,
forlorn?
became
They
the
have
fifth,
video of him.
so on and so forth.
Why are they
vote by mail
doing
ballots
this
were
just a dramatic freaking, what is his name? The documentarian. Anyway, like, they have video of him. They could easily be playing the video, but they're instead playing a picture of him looking forlorn and looking like he disagrees with whatever Trump is saying right in front of him. Chris Baker says Kaufman for Senate, Borisenko for governor. I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you.
tabulated. Trump's lead, grew more narrow, and in some places Biden surpassed, Trump in the vote totals. So as the week wore on, as we paid attention to those numbers multiple
Trump
times a day,
is the worst staffing person in the history.
I was feeling
God, I'll tell you what, if Trump hired me to be a staffing person, which would never happen ever, just so we're clear, I'm not shilling or anything, that would never happen. But if Trump hired me to help him staff whatever he wants to staff, his staff would be so much better and so much more competent than all of these ridiculous people that Trump hires because he likes them and likes hanging out with them, and occasionally they kiss his ass and say nice things. Trump hires the worst, most incompetent people in almost every single circumstance, and it always comes back to bite him.
For sure.
What was your view on the state of the election at that point?
Very, very, very bleak. We told him, the group that went over there outlined, my belief in chances for success at this point, and then we pegged it at 5, maybe 10% based on recounts that either were automatically initiated or could be initiated based on realistic legal challenges, not all the legal challenges that eventually were pursued. But it was my belief is that it was a very, very 5 to 10%. It's not a very good optimistic outlook.
Now, as President Trump and others continued to claim that the election was stolen, there were lawyers who were a part of the campaign lawyers who were responsible for investigating the fraud claims. That includes Alex Cannon, who could not validate the claims that were being made, including those being made by the president. Let's roll video 15.
This is an email. It's 2 emails, actually.
Again,
the first is from Alex
forlorn
Cannon
look.
to you and Faith McPherson. And then you forward that email on to Mark Meadows, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, the subject being AZ federal ID voters. If you look at the original email there, it says, Bill, we completed the AZ analysis you requested. I assume that's about Arizona. And because of the substantial uncertainty surrounding the databases, this is a highly unreliable way to identify ineligible voters. Can you explain the task that you gave to Ms. Cannon for this Arizona analysis?
Sure. Previously, I described some of my frustration with some of the claims that people would throw at President Trump regarding, need to look at this, this happened in this state or that happened in that state. And it would be, those would flow to us to look into. I talked about that before, I think.
Yep.
This is an example of that. I recall in Arizona, someone had thrown out, I believe this to be the claim, that there were thousands of illegal citizens, people not eligible to vote, having cast their ballots in Arizona. Someone had thrown out that claim to President Trump. And with, the margins being as close as they were, as I previously described, that could potentially matter. So this wild claim is thrown out, which, on its face didn't seem, realistic or possible to me. I asked Alex to look at the claim, and I haven't read this full email, but I recall the response to that. The reality of that was not illegal citizens voting in the election. I think it was like overseas voters voting in the election. So obviously, people who were eligible to vote.
When these findings were passed up the chain to President Trump, he became frustrated and he replaced the campaign's legal team. Let's play clip 14.
Trump made a smart move.
The president, it was during the second week where things like you displayed were occurring, where he was, growing increasingly unhappy with, his team. Me less so because I was less involved at this point, but still me, growing increasingly unhappy with Justin Clark, and that kind of, paved the way for Justin to be moved out and Mayor Giuliani to be moved in as the person in charge of the legal.
Okay, I take that back. Trump did not make a smart move. Rudy Giuliani should not have been put in charge of that. I'm sorry. That was also another mistake. Another staffing mistake.
Manager. He was the second Trump campaign manager for the 2020 race, and there were only about 115 days until Election Day. So let's play the video.
I inherited a campaign that was, the day I was hired was, I believe, President Trump's low point in the 2020 daily average polling against President Biden. It was a campaign at a low point in the polls. It was structurally and fiscally deficient. There was a great deal wrong with the campaign in both of those areas. So most of my day spent fixing what, and I think I took over with 115 days left in the campaign. Most of my time was spent fixing the things that could be fixed with 115 days left in the campaign.
Mr. Stepien has been in the campaign field for a long time, and he worked for
probably
lots of
another
different
bad hire
candidates in campaigns. He testified to this committee about his concerns given the claims that Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell and their team were making publicly. Let's play clip 15.
Okay, and was it important for you, Mr. Stepien, to sort of pull back just for your own professional reputation? You didn't want to be associated with some of what you were hearing from the Giuliani team and others that sort of stepped in the wake of your departure?
I didn't mind being categorized. There were two groups of family. We called them kind of my team and Rudy's team. I didn't mind being characterized as being part of Team Normal, as reporters, kind of started to do around that point in time. I said, hours ago, early on that.
Okay,
I've been doing this for a long time.
I don't like Rudy Giuliani. In this I don't really have an opinion of him outside of this context, but in this context, I think that he was not competent and not capable and screwed a lot of shit up. I also think Sidney Powell is crazy. And I always thought Sidney Powell was crazy. And a lot of people like, Karlyn, but the Kraken, and look what she did for Michael Flynn. Sidney Powell is a nut job. I'm sorry. And then Lynn Wood on top of that, epic nut job. However, just because I don't like any of those people and I don't like what they did, I don't like this guy either. And I think this guy is actually worse. So to call him Team Normal, again, this is, I fucking guarantee you, I don't know anything about this guy other than what I've already heard in this hearing. This is an establishment shill that Trump hired when he shouldn't have hired him. I don't know why he hired him to be his final campaign manager, probably on bad advice from someone else. But I promise you, if I actually looked into this guy, what we're going to find is establishment shill parading as Team Normal. Remember, this is the same guy that also thinks that Mike Pence is normal, right? This is an RNC establishment shill.
25 years, and I've spanned,
probably always hated Trump.
Ideologies from Trump to McCain to Bush to Christie, and I can work under a lot of circumstances for a lot of varied
Want
you
to
know,
make a
candidates
lot
and
of money because you
politicians,
make a
but,
lot of money as campaign manager, man. It is
situation
a
where,
lucrative.
and I think along the way I built
He
up
made a
pretty
boat
good,
ton of money
good
and then threw
reputation
Trump under the
for
bus.
being honest and professional. And I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
So the president did get rid of Team Normal, and I'd like to play a clip showing that the president found the people he needed to perpetuate his claims of fraud.
They saw a big truck bringing in 100,000 ballots in garbage cans, in waste paper baskets, in cardboard boxes, and in shopping baskets. And every single one of them was for Biden because they were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said. If you gave me the paper ballots, I could probably turn around each one of these states. I'm absolutely convinced if you let me examine each one of those ballots, I'd pull out enough that were fraudulent that it would shake the hell out of the country.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm.
I remember that one of the things Mark said at some point was, you can't show an actual vote was flipped, which I found at the time to be a remarkable assertion because you don't have to have the gun to see the body lying on the floor bleeding out with 5 bullet holes in it was killed by a gun.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts. And then the theory was also completely nuts, right? I mean, it was a combination of Italians, the Germans. I mean, different things have been floating around as to who was involved. Remember, Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan, she has an affidavit from somebody who says they wrote a software in and something with the Philippines and that, just all over the radar.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess.
Jared Kushner is so
yes.
weird looking.
Tell me what you said.
He doesn't look like a real human being.
Okay. And how did he react? How did President Trump react when you shared that?
Can you imagine him and Ivanka having sex? Can you even imagine how that goes?
Confidence in Rudy. I think I had conversations with probably all of our council who are signed up to assist on election day as they disengaged with the campaign. The general consensus was that the law firms were not comfortable making the arguments that Rudy Giuliani was making publicly. I seem to recall that I had a similar conversation with
Yeah,
all.
Laura, we need to ask
clear I
Joshua
did
if
not
Jared
agree
Kushner is a
with
lizard
The
person.
idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff.
We definitely
which I
need to
told
do
the president
that.
was bullshit. And, you know, I didn't want to be a part of it. And that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
Even Sidney Powell, defending herself in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems, argued that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that her statements were truly statements of fact. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, to be fair, Rachel
I'd
Maddow
like to
said the
witness
same
supporting
thing.
us today. The first panel is now dismissed.
That's it? That's literally it. That's literally it. Wow.
We've been listening to the first portion of today's hearing by the House.
Without
January.
objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Oh, good. More talk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, we presented the testimony of former Attorney General Bill Barr, who testified before this committee. Today, we present additional evidence, including his testimony that former President Trump started making claims of election fraud immediately after the election, and that Barr concluded the claims were untrue. Now, due to the length of Attorney General Barr's testimony, we're only going to include relevant portions at the hearing today.
We're going to edit out all the portions
video.
that we don't want you to hear that don't support our narrative. We're only going to include the portions that support our narrative. Okay, got it.
Specific and credible allegations of fraud, made an effort to look into these to satisfy ourselves that they were without merit. And
we're going to
I was in
help
the
you out by
posture of
editing
trying
the
to
most
figure out,
salient points to support
there's
our
an avalanche
narrative.
of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days, and it was like playing whack-a-mole because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly. And
They're editing it together to make it seem like he's saying one thing into another. So they're trying to make it seem like things build on things when they really don't. But that's how they've edited it together. Don't be fooled by this.
Based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box.
I'm gonna speed it up a
to
little
give
bit
me
more.
any, feeling that there was really substance here.
Only got an hour left.
For the first time since the election, the Attorney General spoke personally with the President on November 23rd, and this was at the White House. Let's play the video, please.
So on November 23rd, I hadn't spoken to the President since the election. And in fact, as I said, since the middle of October, roughly. And it was a little getting awkward because obviously he had lost the election and I hadn't said anything to him. And so Cipollone said, I think it's time you come over here. And so I came over to meet with the President in the Oval Office, and Meadows and Cipollone were there. And the President, and this is leading up to this conversation with Kushner, the President said there had been major fraud, and that as soon as the facts were out, the results of the election would be reversed. And he went on this for quite a while, as he's prone to do. And then he got to something that I was expecting, which is to say that apparently the Department of Justice doesn't think that it has a role of looking into these fraud claims. So I said, that has to be the campaign that raises that with the state. The department doesn't take side in elections, and the department is not an extension of your legal team. And our role is to investigate fraud, and we'll look at something if it's specific, credible, and could have affected the outcome of the election. And we're doing that, and it's just not they're just not meritorious. They're not panning out. And as I walked out of the Oval Office, Jared was there with Dan Scavino, who ran the president's social media. And
Dan Scavino has blocked me on Twitter for some unknown reason. I have no idea what I did to the guy.
How long is
never even interacted with him?
Carry on with this stolen election stuff. Where's this going to go? And by that time, Meadows had caught up with me and leaving the office, and caught up with me and said that he said, look, I think that he's becoming more realistic and knows that there's a limit how far he can take this. And then Jared said, yeah, we're working on this. We're working on it.
Even after his Attorney General told him his claims of election fraud were false, President Trump continued to promote these claims.
I felt that things continued to deteriorate between the 23rd and the weekend of the 29th. And then on November 29th, he appeared on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Futures, I believe it was. And he said that the department was missing in action.
Well, no, we had glitches where they moved thousands of votes from my account to Biden's account. And these are glitches. So they're not glitches, they're theft. They're fraud, absolute fraud. This election was over, and then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania and all over. How the FBI and Department of Justice, I don't know, maybe they're involved, but how people are allowed to get away from this stuff with this stuff is unbelievable.
Now, spurred by what he saw, Barr told the Associated Press on December 1st that there was no evidence of election fraud. And immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. So I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made the statement that to date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows. This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office. So I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipollone's office and we were talking with each other. And the word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point, I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit. And unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process. So they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations. And so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. And I told him that the stuff.
Then why didn't they let anyone witness it?
I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit, and he was indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I found to be among the most disturbing allegations. Disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegation.
By the way, in New Hampshire, there is actually a town in New Hampshire in which they have found mysteriously that votes were actually flipped in smaller quantities, but in hyper consistent quantities on Dominion voting machines. That's actually true. That happened. Now, we're not talking about enough to like win anything with Trump, but they did find, and I'm going to quote this wrong, and I haven't looked at the information in a while, but they did find that these voting machines flipped votes, like 150 of them per like candidate, from Republican to Democrat, and it was like really consistent across candidates. So I'm just saying, I mean, that I never believed the Dominion story. I thought that was stupid. I never believed there was a Kraken, but just saying.
But they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a great disservice to the country.
Okay, so the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in Hara. We have a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip,
Victor brought me
you can press a button
taquitos
for Trump, and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
so I can actually eat something for dinner that's not Takis.
Barr again told the president that there was
Still
nothing to
probably
these
not
claims
healthy.
on December 14th.
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group. And he held up the report, and then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, this is absolute proof.
We still haven't
the
talked
Dominion
about
machines
January
were
6th
rigged.
today.
The report means
Great
that I'm
point,
going to have a
Bender.
second
Great
term.
point.
And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, these machines were designed to, engage in fraud. Or something
Damn
to
right,
that
they're
effect, but I
gas
didn't see
station
any supporting
taquitos, Brent.
information
Gas
for it.
station taquitos
And
are
I
the
was
best. I'm sorry, you're not going to change my
demoralized
mind on this. They're the
because I thought,
best.
boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact with he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, when I went into this and would, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Well, maybe you can assess that 2000 Mules and people are talking about
Yes, please debunk
Well,
the
just in a
movie.
nutshell, I just think the GBI was unimpressed with it, and I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think I was holding my fire on that.
There is absolutely no reason for them to even bring this movie up. There's no reason for them to even bring this movie up. Let's just keep that in mind. They are purposefully bringing that movie up because that movie was effective. There was no, if it is just so obviously fake and obviously false, then why would they even bother mentioning it in Congress? And deliberately, remember, because they already told us, they were like, we have edited out we have edited the salient points from Mr. Barr's testimony. They wanted you to see him saying that, and they wanted you to see him and that entire room of people laughing, even though it actually bared no value on what they're actually supposed to be investigating, which is January effing 6th.
I had to see what the photographic evidence was because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was. But the cell phone data is singularly unimpressive. I mean, basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, if you go by a box, 5 boxes or whatever it was, that's a mule is just indefensible. By definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I mean, I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals. This was some kind of contractor, and our route would take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely lack. I mean, there was
Look
a
at how
little bit
much
of it, but
time
it
they're
was lacking,
spending
It didn't
debunking
establish
2,000
widespread,
Mules right now.
Illegal.
How much time have they already spent
Harvesting. The other thing is
debunking
people
this
don't
movie that
understand is
happened
that,
after all of what they're
it's not
supposed to be
clear that even if you
investigating?
can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. You're not, the courts are not going to
No,
throw
and
out
even if it
votes,
was true, it
and
didn't
then figure
change
out what votes were
anything.
harvested
Even
and
if it
throw them
was
out. It's still the
true, and we're
burden
not
on the
saying it's
challenging
true,
party to show that
but
illegal
even if
votes
it
were
was
cast.
true, it
Votes
didn't
were
change anything.
the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, the person was non-compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was.
They just spent more time talking about 2,000 Mules than they did questioning their 2 witnesses that have already appeared. They've spent more time trying to debunk this movie than questioning their own effing witnesses. They're scared of this movie, man. Dinesh D'Souza, and I haven't even seen the movie yet, but like Dinesh hit on something. Let's just be honest. If they're this scared of that effing movie, Dinesh is probably right on track.
Possible to talk sense to the president, and while you sometimes had to engage in a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track. But I felt that after the election, he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
Good, Bill. GTFO.
So on December 14th, Barr quit. Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Other than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say, there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, how people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information. That's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view. It's been debunked.
A month and a half or so after the election day. At that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed, and Eric and Pat.
I didn't want to watch that movie up until right this second, where they're talking about this damn movie.
None of those allegations have been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status, outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned, anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with the technology problem and with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state.
Everyone needs to start voting libertarian.
And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
People have got to stop worrying about the Republicans losing. If you're voting Republican, you're voting for the establishment. Start voting libertarian. They need to lose.
I believe I had about a 15-second
They need to lose to
conversation with the
learn.
President about it as well.
When was that?
During one of the visits to the White House. I don't know which one.
And
I
to
think it was the
hopefully
first one
find
in
their balls
November.
someday.
I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter.
Well,
the
they're
results of the
certainly never
election.
going to learn
And
if they
he
don't
thanked me.
lose.
That was our interaction.
If they win, they are never going to learn anything.
At a later hearing, you'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donahue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000.
I don't believe that for
So the
one red
president
second.
accepted that.
Sorry, no,
He said,
don't
"Okay,
believe you.
fine, but what about the others?" And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation. So then I talked about a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And this claim was by a truck driver who believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there in the public and discussed. And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay.
Then what was in the truck?
Then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on the suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots.
What?
The suitcase was rolled out from under the table.
It was. We all
And
saw
I
the
said,
video.
no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all. I told him there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was
Sure.
taking one ballot and
Don't believe what your lying eyes tell you is what we're hearing right now.
scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told him that the video did not support that. Then he went off on double voting. At the top of the next page, he said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote. He meant people on Native American reservations. He said, there's lots of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the allegations, but they don't pan out.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered
59
through technical compromise,
leading
and 5 other
election
reports
security
from organizations
scientists.
and individuals
That's a
confirming
profession?
There was no widespread fraud in the 2020
How many people in
election
this country
or
are
describing the
election
spread of
security
the former,
scientists?
President's lies.
They literally
Without
made up
objection,
that
so ordered.
job. They made it
Thank
up.
you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the order of the committee for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Oh, good. Bathroom break. All right. So we are going to
And
be
with that,
fast
Chair,
forwarding
Committee Chair,
through bathroom break. But I just want to remind everyone that I need to wrap up in about 45 minutes at 7 p.m. because I am doing a community Zoom call with my locals community. And just fast forwarding through right now to find our spot for when they come back. And if you would like to join my locals community Zoom tonight and in 45 minutes, what you can do is head over to kb.locals.com/support and sign up for $5 a month, $50 a year, make a one-time gift, whatever's clever, whatever works for you. All those things get you access to my private community Zooms where you get to talk about whatever you want to talk about. It's not just me lecturing. We all talk. We are a community. We are a community of friends and sane people. I'm sure we're going to be talking about the hearing today. So it might be a really good day to join and come check out my locals community. And when you do, you'll be supporting the work I do on this channel. Please make sure you mount the like button for me, and please make sure you subscribe to the channel if you have not already.
City Commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, where he served for more than 10 years. Mr. Ginsburg is one of the leading election law attorneys in the country and has represented Republican presidential candidates in election litigation dating back to 2000, where he represented George W. Bush in the Bush v. Gore litigation. I will now swear in our...
So establishment shill. Establishment shill. Got it.
Please stand and raise your
Got
right
it.
hand.
Are we going to hear
We
from
swear
anyone in
our
these
firm
hearings that's
on the
not an
tones of
establishment
privilege
shill?
That the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the break, I think you all heard Mr. Barr and Mr. Donahue talk about the false claims that Mr. Trump and his supporters made about suitcases of fake ballots in Georgia. We have a witness here today who thoroughly investigated that issue.
Video. There's
Mr. Tack, I
video
wanna
of
thank you for
this.
appearing before us
There's
today.
literal
You were
video.
appointed by President Trump to serve as a U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you served from 2017
Why don't they
until
play the
January
video?
2021. You were the lead federal prosecutor there and worked for the Department of Justice under then Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Lofgren. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case, the case at issue. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena.
Yes, can we
in Atlanta, which is
can
also
we
in Fulton
watch
County,
that
the city of
tape just
Atlanta.
for our own
I'm
edification?
sorry, city of, yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots reported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after our call that he was going to go to the White House for a meeting, and then that issue might come up. He asked me to make it a priority to get to the bottom of, to try to substantiate the allegation made by Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you. I understand the Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated those State Farm Arena allegations and didn't find any evidence of fraud. What did you find when your office conducted its own investigation?
We found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of his misunderstanding that there were.
So what they're doing is they're trying to deflect. They're basically being like, no, that wasn't a suitcase. That was a bin. These are totally different. It wasn't a suitcase at all. Anyone who said it was a suitcase of ballots, it wasn't a suitcase. Don't worry, nothing to see here. It wasn't a suitcase. It was a bin. It doesn't fucking matter whether or not it was a suitcase or whether or not it was a bin. The point, if we can all remember back, the point is that they wrapped up for the night, they sent volunteers home, and then they pulled this thing containing ballots out from under the table, and they proceeded to keep counting. That was the point. It was not whether it was a suitcase or whether it was a bin. It was that they sent people home. They said they were done for the night. The news announced they were done for the night. And then mysteriously, they pulled a box out from under a table that had more ballots, and they kept counting. That was the issue, not whether it was a suitcase or a bin. That doesn't matter.
Done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night. And the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. But once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continued to tally the ballots from the lockbox.
Without the observers.
Fortunately, during the Senate hearing, Mr. Giuliani only
magically
played a clip that showed them pulling out
without the observers
and referring to that as a smoking gun of fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box back out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
They literally had them on video double counting the ballots. I saw the video. I saw it at the Trump rally in Georgia. They showed it on a giant screen. They literally had video of them double counting effing ballots. That is a lie. This guy is lying.
I'd like to play again a testimony from
I want
Mr. Donahue, who
cross-examination in
appeared
this hearing.
committee before today.
Mr. Donahue, we talked at some length about whether or not the White House or the president was informed about the Antrim report. On the results of the investigations, the interviews that have gone on Fulton County, how would those results have been communicated to the White House, to the president?
I don't know how they were.
I heard something
communicated.
about
do
it, but
know
I
that they
didn't
came
really
up in
look into it
subsequent
that far,
conversations with the
Naruto.
president, and Dag Rose and I essentially told him we looked into that, and it's just not true.
Okay, so he wasn't.
I don't believe anything this guy
I
says.
told
This
the
guy's a
president
snake.
myself that several times in several
This guy's a
conversations that
snake.
these allegations about ballots being smuggled in.
That's just
into
my
this case
gut
and
feeling about
run
him.
through the machine several times. It was not true. That we looked at the video, we interviewed the witnesses. It was not true.
Mr. Pack, after you left the U.S. Attorney's Office on January 4th, 2021, did the next U.S. Attorney there, I think Mr. Trump's personal pick, Bobby Christine, did he investigate any remaining claims of fraud? And if so, did he find any evidence that supported the president's claims of voter fraud?
It is my understanding that Mr. Christine continued any investigations that were pending at the time of my departure, but he was unable to find any evidence of fraud that affected the outcome of the election.
So after investigating the president's and Mr. Giuliani's claims about voter fraud in Georgia, is it your view today that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to undermine confidence in the outcome of the election in Georgia?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Pack. And I want to thank you also for the service that you've given to our country. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn to President
Thank you for
Trump's
being
false
an
allegations
establishment
about election
shill.
integrity in Philadelphia.
Your
The
check
Attorney
is in the
General discussed
mail.
these allegations at some length.
You know, the idea, the president has repeatedly suggested that there was some kind of outpouring of unexpected votes in inner city areas like Philadelphia. As recently as January 13th, when he walked off the NPR set, he was asked by the interviewer, what's your evidence of fraud? And he said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters. And that was absolute rubbish. The turnout in Philadelphia was in line with the state's turnout. And in fact, it was not as impressive as many suburban counties. And there was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout. It wasn't like there was all these unexpected votes that came out in Philadelphia. So, I think once you actually look at the votes, and then there's an obvious explanation. For example, in Pennsylvania, Trump ran weaker than the Republican ticket generally. He ran weaker than two of the state candidates. He ran weaker than the congressional delegation running for federal Congress, and he ran weaker than the Republican, I think. I haven't looked at this recently, but he generally was a weak element on the Republican ticket. So that does not suggest that the election was stolen by fraud.
How about Pennsylvania, Bill?
Wait.
We're talking to the U.S. Attorney.
Trump got the most votes of like any Republican incumbent in the history of the Republican Party. Trump got the most votes. And you're telling me that Trump was just a weak part of the ticket, Bill? That makes no godly sense.
Philadelphia about an alleged discrepancy between the number of absentee ballots issued and the number of ballots cast.
Right. So that was one of the big ones for a period of time. I think that was raised at Gettysburg by Giuliani or something like that, but it kept on being repeated, and I found it annoying because
God,
it didn't seem that it was right. So I called McSwain.
I have so many things I want to say about this on my locals
no, the
community
problem
Zoom
is
that I'd
that
probably get
Giuliani
kicked off
threw
of
out
YouTube if I said.
Throughout this number, and what he did was he mixed apples and oranges. He took the number of applications for the Republican primary and he compared it to the number of absentee votes cast in the general election. But once you actually go and look,
Generally speaking, those thoughts revolve around getting rid of the entire government.
I think at some point I covered that with the
in a
president.
totally legal and ethical way, of course.
We have another witness here today who has detailed knowledge about the election process in Philadelphia. Mr. Schmidt, at the time of the 2020 presidential election, you were serving as the only Republican member of Philadelphia's three-member city commission, which is responsible for overseeing elections throughout the city. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressperson.
So President Trump made numerous claims regarding fraudulent voting practices in Philadelphia, including the claim that dead people were voting. In fact, Mr. Giuliani told Pennsylvania state legislators that 8,000 dead people voted in Pennsylvania. You investigated those claims of voter fraud. Can you tell us what you found?
Not only was there not evidence of 8,000 dead voters voting in Pennsylvania, there wasn't evidence of 8. We took seriously every case that was referred to us, no matter how fantastical, no matter how absurd, and took every one of those seriously, including these.
Bullshit.
As it turns
Bullshit.
out, even Mr. Trump's
Lie.
campaign
Lie.
voters
Look
knew
at
that
this
the dead
guy's
voter
eyes.
claims weren't
Liar.
I guess the crooks in Philadelphia are disappointed in this. They only submitted 8,021 ballots from dead people, mail-in ballots for dead people. Probably easier for dead people to submit mail-in ballots than it is to vote in person.
Rudy was at this stage of his life in the same ability to manage things at this level or not. And obviously, I think Bernie Kerik publicly said it. They never proved the allegations that they were making, and they were trying to develop.
I know a woman who found more than 8 people whose maiden name had been used to vote after they changed their name, after they got married and had moved to a completely different state. So this is bullshit. This is such a show trial. It's so ridiculous.
Mr. Schmidt, on November 11th, 2020, President Trump tweeted about you, saying, and here's a quote, "A guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican or rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media."
Oh, so this guy's got a bone to pick. This guy's pissed at Trump. He's got a bone to
He
pick.
refuses to look at a mountain of corruption, dishonesty.
Like,
We win.
no, I am
As
not a
a result of
rhino.
that
I
tweet
am not. I
and the
cannot
CNN
believe
interview you
Trump
gave where you
tweeted that I
stated
was
that
a
dead voter
rhino.
claims
I'll
in
show
Pennsylvania
him
were
how
false.
rhino
You
I
and your
am.
staff were subjected to disturbing threats. Can you tell us about that?
The threats prior to that tweet, and on some level, it feels almost silly to talk about a tweet, but we can really see the impact that they have, because prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. Corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them. You're what the Second Amendment is for. You're walking into the lion's den, all sorts of things like that. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way that he did, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, our address, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail that you could imagine. That was what changed with that tweet.
Behind me are redacted threats that you received, that you provided to the committee. Now, we redacted portions of the text to protect your family. Mr. Schmidt, I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are deeply sorry for what you and your loved ones have been through. And I also want to thank you for your service.
Wait, those are the
to your
worst?
country
They
and
had
for
two
standing up for the rule of
examples?
law. I want to
That
thank
was
both
it?
Mr. Pack and Mr.
I get
Schmidt
more
for
death
their
threats
service,
on like
their
a monthly
testimony,
basis.
and for standing up for the rule of law. Now, I'd like to turn to another
Thankfully, I don't get
subject.
them all the time, but like I get more menacing emails than that every day.
The courts in our country provide a legitimate venue for campaigns to challenge.
I don't
what
even
they
say
view
anything that
as
controversial.
irregular election practices. Now, courts have the final say on how the law applies to those challenges. We have a renowned legal expert here to address the Trump campaign's activities in court. Mr. Ginsburg, you've spent your entire career representing Republicans in elections. You served as the National Counsel on Republican presidential campaigns in 2004.
Chill.
In the 2000 Florida recount that led to the Supreme
Establishment
Court's
chill.
decision in Bush v. Gore. You served as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I think it's fair to say you're the most prominent Republican lawyer who's litigated in the election field. Now, you've analyzed the Trump campaign's litigation pretty carefully. What's the normal process for post-election litigation? How is the Trump campaign's different from the kinds of post-election litigation you've been involved in and know about?
In the normal course of things, any campaign on the night of the election and the days after will do a couple of different things. One is that they'll analyze precinct results to look for abnormalities in the results, and they'll send people to those precincts to ask more questions. Secondly, all campaigns will have poll watchers and poll workers and observers in the polling place. And so campaigns will talk to those people if they saw any irregularities that could cause problems in the election. Now, the Trump campaign talked pre-election about having 50,000 poll workers. So presumably, they did have eyes on the ground in all these places. And so in the normal course of things, a campaign will analyze the reports that come in. Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims
I haven't
of
talked to
fraud
Elle in a
and
while. I really have
irregularities,
no idea,
were made,
to be
you've heard
honest. I don't have any
very
bad vibes with
compelling
Elle. I love
testimony
Elle. I
from
think
Mr.
Elle is
Stepien, from
awesome
Matt Morgan,
and does
from
great
Alex
work. I just
Cannon
haven't talked to her in a long
about
time. I hope
those
she's doing
claims
well.
and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So are you aware of any instance in which a court found the Trump campaign's fraud claims to be credible?
No, there was never that instance. In all the cases that were brought in, I've looked at the more than 60 that include more than 180 counts. And no, the simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
The Select Committee has identified 62 post-election lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Those cases resulted in 61 losses and only a single victory, which actually didn't affect the outcome for either candidate. Despite those 61 losses, President Trump and his allies claim that the courts refused to hear them out, and as a result, they never had their day in court. Mr. Ginsburg, what do you say about the claims that Mr. Trump wasn't given an opportunity to provide the evidence they had of voter fraud? Did they in fact, did they have their day in court?
They did have their day in court. About half of those cases that you mentioned were dismissed at the procedural stage for a lack of standing.
That means they didn't have their day in
court. Or there
court.
wasn't sufficient evidence.
That literally means they didn't have their day in
dismissed
court.
on a motion to dismiss. But in the other, there was discussion of the merits that was contained in the complaints. And in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. And it's also worth noting that even if the Trump campaign complained that it did not have its day in court, there have been post-election reviews in each of the 6 battleground states that could have made a difference. And those ranged from the somewhat farcical Cyber Ninjas case in Arizona to the Michigan Senate report that was mentioned earlier, the hand recount in Georgia that Mr. Pack addressed. And in each one of those instances, there was no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters.
Thank you. As Mr. Ginsburg has explained, there are
It's
no
not
cases
true.
where the Trump campaign was able to convince a court that there was widespread fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election. Over and over, judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike directly
And I'm a person
refuted
where I
this
think I'm
false
completely,
narrative.
I actually
They
think I have
called
a
out the
pretty
Trump
reasonable
campaign's
view
lack
of this. I
evidence
don't
for
think
its
there's any
claims,
way in
and the
hell
judges
Joe
did
Biden
that
got
even in
81
cases
million
where they
votes.
could have
No
simply
way in this
thrown out the
universe, no
lawsuit
way in
without
this lifetime.
writing a word.
But I think that some of the things that were suggested were crazy.
You can see behind me a few
But
excerpts
some of
from
the things that were
decisions in these
suggested were
62
not
cases.
crazy.
The Trump campaign's lack of evidence was criticized by judges across the political spectrum. In Pennsylvania, a Trump-appointed judge concluded, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here." Another Trump-appointed judge warned that if cases like these succeeded, quote, "Any disappointed loser in a presidential election able to hire a team of clever lawyers could flag claimed deviations from election results and cast doubt on election results." The list goes on and on. Allegations are called, quote, "an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation." In another, strained legal arguments without merit, unsupported by evidence, derived from wholly unreliable sources, a fundamental and obvious misreading of the Constitution. The rejection of President Trump's litigation efforts was overwhelming. 22 federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, including 10 appointed by President Trump himself, and at least 24 elected or appointed Republican state judges dismissed the president's claims. At least 11 lawyers have been referred for disciplinary proceedings due to bad faith and baseless efforts to undermine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Rudy Giuliani had his license to practice law suspended in New York. And just this week, a newly filed complaint will potentially make his suspension from practicing law in DC permanent. And as we've just heard from perhaps the most preeminent Republican election lawyer in recent history,
From
the
our
Trump campaign's
favorite
unprecedented effort to
establishment
overturn its election laws
show.
in court was a deeply damaging abuse of the judicial process, as stated by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter. This
I
was,
hate these
quote,
people so
"a
much.
coup in search of a legal theory."
A
Thank you, Mr.
coup in
Chairman.
search of a legal theory?
I want to thank our
People are
witnesses for
allowed to
joining us
ask
today.
questions, dude.
The members of the select committee may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The second
We've
panel of
literally
witnesses
heard more
is now
about 2,000 mules in this hearing than we have about January 6th. Is that it? Can't be it. It's not done yet.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for a closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now that we understand the litigation efforts by President Trump and his allies, I'd like to present additional actions taken by the Trump campaign during this time. President Trump continued to push the stolen election narrative, even though he and his allies knew that their litigation efforts, making the same claim, had failed. It's worth pointing out that litigation generally does not continue past the safe harbor date of December 14th. But the fact that this litigation went on, well, that decision makes more sense when you consider the Trump campaign's fundraising tactics. Because if the litigation had stopped on December 14th, there would have been no fight to defend the election and no clear path to continue to raise millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd ask for unanimous consent
I
to
would
include in the
say
record a video presentation describing how President Trump used the lies he told to raise millions of dollars from the American people. These
I would
fundraising
say that
schemes were also
conservatives
part of
do
the
give
effort
money to stupid
to
things.
disseminate the false claims of election fraud.
Like a lot of
My
money.
name is Amanda Wick, and I'm Senior Investigative Counsel with the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to
Hang
Trump
on.
supporters, sometimes as many as 20.
I have a question before we watch this video. Why aren't these people being called as witnesses? Why, instead of calling these people as witnesses to explain in a way where they have to answer questions live in front of an audience, why are we instead seeing these elaborately produced propaganda videos? Because they could just call this woman as a witness. There doesn't need to be a production value behind it. So why isn't that happening? Because this is propaganda. We're watching propaganda. And I don't like those fundraising emails either. And I think it was stupid for conservatives to continue to fund this bullshit. I do. I don't approve of any of that. I got 8,000 of those emails, probably 8,000 in a single day. But oh yeah, exactly. If they're just doing a nice video that they're just showing as a piece of propaganda, they don't have to put the witnesses under oath. That makes a lot of sense, Boris. Well done.
By the day. The emails claimed the quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election, and encouraged them to quote, fight back. But as the select committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false.
Wait,
Yet
how they
continued to barrage
demonstrated it?
small-dollar donors
How
with
they
emails,
demonstrated it? We're
encouraging
still
them to donate to
mid-hearing.
something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The select committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually
No
a fund called the Election
kidding.
Defense Fund.
Is it fair to say that election defense fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic? Yes. And tell us about these funds as marketing tactics. Just a topic matter, where money could potentially how money could potentially be used.
The claims that the election was stolen were so successful, President Trump and his allies raised $250 million, nearly $100 million in the first week after the election. On November 9th, 2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials,
I believe all of this, by the way.
to the Trump
Believe
Hotel
all of it.
collection, and over $5
This
million
part.
to Event Strategies Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6th rally on the Ellipse.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
The evidence developed by the Select Committee highlights how the Trump campaign aggressively pushed false election claims to fundraise, telling supporters it would be used to fight voter fraud that did not exist. The emails continued through January 6th, even as President Trump spoke on the Ellipse. 30 minutes after the last fundraising email was sent, the Capitol was breached.
Oh, come on. Listen, people need to hear this. A lot of what they just said in that video is true. All of that fundraising was bullshit. People never should have given to it in the first place. That was a waste of effing money. Okay, like maybe you could have made the argument right after the election, but they just kept going and pounding 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 and pounding. And anyone who's on those Trump email lists know that those like the marketing tactics they use are insane and crazy, and it's like the worst type of marketing that exists on the planet. And that money did not go to fighting the election fraud issue. It didn't. It went to all the other conservative interest bullshit. And so, while I am generally speaking not on these people's side, what they just said was completely true in that one specific context, and people need to hear about that because it will protect you from being taken advantage of next time.
Every American is entitled and encouraged to participate in our electoral process. Political fundraising is part of that. Small dollar donors use scarce disposable income to support candidates and causes of their choosing, to make their voices heard. And those donors deserve the truth about what those funds will be used for. Throughout the committee's investigation, we found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for. So not only was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going. They deserve better than what President Trump and his team did. Mr. Chairman,
Well, the
I yield
DNC does the same thing.
Without objection, the chair
Democrats
recognizes
do the
young
exact
woman
same
from
fucking
Wyoming.
thing. The Republicans
Cheney,
are not the only
closing
ones that are guilty here. Democrats do the same
Mr.
thing.
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today. And I'd also like to, in particular, wish Mr. Stepien and his family all the best on the arrival of a new baby. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, was very narrowly focused. And in the coming days, you will see the committee move on to President Trump's broader planning for January 6th, including his plan to corrupt the Department of Justice and his detailed planning with lawyer John Eastman to pressure the vice president, state legislatures, state officials, and others to overturn the election. Let me leave you today with one clip to preview what you will see in one of our hearings to come. This is the testimony of White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. John Eastman called Mr. Hirschman the day after
Real
January 6th,
hearings
and here's how
don't
that
need
conversation went.
cliffhangers. Real hearings don't need
I
previews.
said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on: orderly transition.
That was completely unnecessary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
At the conclusion of last week's hearing, we showed you a video of rioters explaining why they had come to Washington on January 6th. It was because Donald Trump told them to be here. Today, we heard about some of the lies Donald Trump embraced and amplified when it became clear he didn't have the numbers of votes to win the election. We heard about how officials at different levels of government explored claims of fraud and found no evidence. Yet the former president continued to repeat those false claims over and over again. Today, we'll end things where we did on Thursday, back on January 6th. hearing words of individuals who wanted to stop the transfer of power. We know they were there because of Donald Trump. Now we hear
It's not
some
why
of the
most
things
of those
they
people were
believe.
there.
Without objection, I enter into the record a video presentation.
I know exactly what's going on right now. Fake election. You think they're gonna fucking see us out of our vote and put communist fucking Biden in office? It ain't fucking happening today, buddy. You voted?
Yes, sir.
How'd it go?
Voted early. It went well, except for the can't really trust the software. Dominion software all over.
We voted, and right in the top right-hand corner of the Dominion voting machine that we used, there was a Wi-Fi symbol with 5 bars. So that most definitely connected to the internet, without a doubt. So they stole that from us twice. We're not doing it anymore. We're not taking it anymore. So we're standing up. We're here, and whatever happens, we're not laying down again.
It didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't work. No. Trust the system. 200,000 people that weren't even registered voted. 430,000 votes were here from President Trump's ballot, and you can't stand there and tell me that it worked.
I don't want to say that what we're doing is right. But if the election's being stolen, what is it going to take?
The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Oh, God. All right, guys. So that is day 2 of our committee hearings. We made it. We didn't hear much about January 6th, did we? Isn't that funny? On a committee that's supposed to be investigating January 6th, we really didn't hear all that much about January 6th. We had, in fact, heard more about 2,000 Mules than we heard about January 6th. Why are we even talking about a movie that came out after January 6th? Why is it so important for Liz Cheney to discredit 2,000 Mules, even though it has nothing to do with what her committee is supposed to be investigating? That's the question I have after all this. Sean says the charge is that Trump incited insurrection. This is all completely irrelevant to whether or not Trump committed a crime. Bad politics isn't a crime. That's exactly right. Trump made so many boneheaded decisions, man. We could probably do several days worth of streams on the boneheaded decisions that Trump made throughout this entire thing. And who knows, maybe we will. That doesn't mean he committed a crime, and it doesn't mean he incited an insurrection to overturn an election. That's bullshit. And Sam says that Justice Bat in the background, subliminal. Indeed it is, Sam. Indeed it is. All right, guys. Well, that's all I have for today. When is the next committee hearing? Don't tell me it's tomorrow. Okay, January 6th hearing. Day 3. When is the next one? Is it tomorrow at like 9 a.m. or something? Hang on. Scheduled for Wednesday. It is scheduled for Wednesday at probably early in the day. I don't know. I'm going to find that out. Maybe I will do a live, reaction. Maybe we'll save it for later in the day. It all depends on what time it is, but I'm going to keep watching these hearings because I want to know what they say. And it's just like, it is absolutely a trip to have been at an event and then to watch a public. I don't know how many of you were actually there on January 6th, but it is like, for me, this whole thing and being involved in so much of like stuff around the 2020 election, it is a complete trip for me to watch the absolute theater and the absolute fiction that is being crafted right in front of me about what it was. It is an experience to watch the government make propaganda about an event that you were physically at and physically witnessed, and to just have like what is presented be so far away from what actually happened. It's ridiculous. But guys, I gotta go because in about 10 minutes, I will be joining the rest of my locals members for our community Zoom. And if you would like to join that community Zoom, what you need to do is head over to kb.locals.com/support. The link is down in the description below. And you can join as a supporter in my community for $5 a month. You can join for $50 a year, which gives you 2 months for free. You can also make a one-time gift. That will get you access to all sorts of exclusive perks just in my locals community. And I'll look forward to connecting with my locals members in just a couple minutes. Go take a break, go refresh your beverage, and let's have a nice chat. All right, guys, that's all I have for today, and we'll see you soon.